Hi, and welcome to a new tips and tricks episode for ForestPack. In this installment, we explain how to control animation applied to scattered objects. ForestPack has 4 unique modes that enable you not only to scatter animated objects with significant memory efficiency, but also to randomise their starting frames, create offsets, and control playback using maps. We'll start the tutorial by looking at the principles of these 4 modes in detail, and then finish up by applying the techniques to this simple scene. Parts of this tutorial use Burcon maps and GrowFX. Don't worry though if you don't own GrowFX, we've included simplified plant animations using Max's native tools. If however you'd like to try GrowFX, a 30-day trial can be downloaded from our store. To illustrate how to turn on animation and master the different modes used to control playback, open the animation exercises.max file included in the downloads for this tutorial. This file contains a simple plane with arrows on it. The arrows are distributed with ForestPack and laid out on a grid so that we can easily see the effects of changes to the animation controls. Also in the scene, to the left of the plane, are 5 animated objects that we'll use in later exercises. If you click on Manage Layers, you'll see there are 4, one for each of the animation modes. Unhide the layer called 1, Follow Geometry. To get started, scrub the animation bar. Nothing happens. This is because animation is off by default. So for the first step, let's enable an animation mode and ensure that we can preview it in the viewports. Select the ForestPack object called FP Follow. Open the animation rollout and then change the mode from disabled to Follow Geometry. And now if you scrub the timeline, still nothing happens. However, if you render a few frames, the animation is working. This is to maintain performance. By default, ForestPack doesn't preview the animation in the viewports. To enable viewport previews, uncheck Animate Only at Render Time from the bottom of the animation rollout. Now if you scrub the timeline, it works in the viewports and at render time exactly as expected. So in these exercise files, to make things clearer in the viewport, ForestPack has been set to display the scattered objects as meshes. If the geometry was more dense or the scatter area larger, this might not be possible. Fortunately, Points Cloud mode also enables you to preview animations, allowing you to get a good indication of the rendered results of more complex scenes. To illustrate this, try the following. Open the display rollout and set the mode to Points Cloud. Let's select the plane and then change the size from 20 by 20 meters to 600 by 600. Now scrub the timeline. You'll see that you can still get a decent idea of the animation in the viewports, despite the number of instances. Though this geometry is simple, the same would apply for much more complex models. Next, we'll look at how to randomise the starting frame of animated objects. To illustrate this, unhide the layer called 2 Random Samples and change the view to the Cam Random Sample camera. Select the forest object called FP Random. Open the animation rollout and check random samples. Scrub the timeline. The arrow's playback is now randomized. You'll notice when you activate random samples mode that the time offset and count parameters become available. These are used to control the sample points along the timeline. To create the points, the count parameter defines the total number of samples, while time offset determines the number of frames between them, starting from frame 0. For example, if we use a count value of 5 and a time offset value of 2, we get these 5 sample points marked in red. You see this starts from frame 0, with 4 further samples each taken 2 frames apart. The bottom row illustrates the sample points on a 30-frame animation. In the resultant scatter, shown in the top row, you can see that only these 5 frames are used. Let's try another example. We'll increase the time offset value to 5 and change the count to 6. This returns 6 samples at frames 0, 5, 10, 15, 20 and 25. And you can see in the top row, these are the ones randomly scattered by ForestPack. These are still animated objects, remember. If you play the animations, they will start from these frames. Understanding the count and time offset parameters is the key to mastering this mode and the next, controlling the starting frame using a map. But before we get onto that, I want to share a few tips about the source geometry. You'll notice that the animations in the exercise file stop at frame 30. This is to be expected, it's when the source geometry stops too. In many cases, this may be the effect you're after, but if you do want the animation to continue throughout the entire duration of the shot, you'll need to be sure that the source object's animation is long enough. This is especially true when randomizing starting points, as the source objects may need to continue animating well beyond the active time segment. What follows are a few tips about preparing animated meshes for ForestPack. Probably the easiest way to create a looped animation is to use the parameter curve out of range options found in the graph editor. To illustrate, we'll make the arrow animation loop instead of stopping at frame 30. So to do this, select the arrow object named bend with keyframes and open the curve editor. From the control view on the left, locate the bend with keyframes object and expand the tracks until you can select angle. Open the out of range types by clicking the icon or by going to edit controller out of range types. And from the resultant dialog, select loop. Note the change in the graph editor. It now shows a dotted line to indicate the new looped animation. This works well, but the repetition of a small loop can become obvious. As another option, some foliage animations lend themselves to using noise controllers. With these you can create a lot more variation, avoiding the obvious repetition of a keyframed loop, and the animation will never accidentally stop. To add a noise controller to create an arrow animation, select the second object, bend with noise controller from the scene, and open the curve editor. From the controller view in the curve editor, locate bend with keyframes object and expand the tracks until you find object bend angle. Right click on this and choose assign controller. From the resultant dialog, pick noise float. Using this we can animate using noise with control for strength and frequency. For this example, you're going to want a low frequency setting of about 0.01 and a strength of about 450, but you should feel free to play with these settings to get interesting alternate results. If you play the animation, the results of your changes to the noise controller can be previewed in real time, making it much easier to get a satisfactory result. When you're happy with it, close the dialog and the graph editor. This technique, coupled with the bend modifier, generates some reasonably decent wind animations for grass and ground cover plants. The non-grow effects grass and trees included in the scene files use this technique. The tree also uses a technique which involves selecting vertices with soft selection, then passing them up the stack to a noise modifier to create some smaller leaf animations. You'll find a link to a post explaining this technique in the written version of this tutorial. If you animate the rotation, translation or scale of an object and then add it to ForestPack, you'll find that the animation is not used in the resultant scatter. This is due to some frightening matrix maths, but fortunately there's a simple workaround. Instead of animating the object directly, simply add an Xform modifier and animate the gizmo instead. This resultant animation is indistinguishable from animating the object directly and works flawlessly when added to ForestPack. Many rigid animations comprise a hierarchy of multiple parts. Ideally, these should be combined into a single object before being scattered by Forest. Though ForestPack can scatter groups, each item in a group is treated as an individual object, so it's unlikely the original position and orientation of the elements will be maintained. The easiest solution is to convert a collection of animated parts into a single proxy. This has the added benefit of caching the animation to disk, so it's very fast to load compared to calculating animation on the fly. In the included scene, instead of using a proxy for the radio telescope, we've actually animated the three parts using railclone. It's a simple setup and there's nothing wrong with using animated railclone objects inside of ForestPack. The only step necessary to ensure the railclone objects render correctly is to go to the display rollout and uncheck use instancing engine. So after that detail, we're back to ForestPack and looking at setting the starting frame with a map. Instead of allowing ForestPack to randomly distribute sample points, you can use a grayscale map to precisely specify the placement of a sample point from which the animation will start. To illustrate this, if it's not already, open the animation exercises max file and do the following. Unhide the layer called 3 random by map and change the view to cam random from map camera. Select the forest object called FP random by map. Open the animation rollout and check random from map. Click on the map slot and select a gradient ramp. Click play. You'll now get a wave effect from front to back. To modify the map, just instance it into the material editor. For example, you could rotate it so that the wave effect animates from side to side. These kinds of effects are great for animations of wind moving across grass, where you'll often see gusts travelling from one side of a field to the other. But before going any further, let's look at the theory of how this works. As in the previous example, the sample points are controlled using the time offset and count parameters to determine the number and frequency of sample points. With this mode, however, they are placed on the surface using a map. For example, using a time offset value of 5 and a count of 6, we get the sample points, shown in red, of 0, 5, 10, 15, 20 and 25. In the top row you can see how the gradient ramp controls their distribution. The grayscale range is equally divided by the count value, with the first frame represented by black and the last represented by white. When the colour exceeds a threshold point, the next frame is displayed. This explains why you can't see frame 25 in the top row, as the gradient is only pure white on the very far right hand side of the row. Let's take a second example. You can see here that if you increase the count to 15 and decrease the offset to 2, you'll get a much smoother wave animation in the top row. More or less any map that is calculated before render time can be used to offset the animation. In particular, noise maps are quite effective for creating wind animations across grass and large areas of forest. The final mode works a little differently. Instead of creating a number of equally spaced sample points along the timeline from which the animation will start playing, you define a range using the start and end parameters. A map is then used to control the absolute frame, displayed based on a grayscale value. Simply scrubbing the timeline in this mode will not result in animation playback. Instead, to control the animation, the grayscale value itself needs to change. Let's take a look at a couple of examples, starting with a typical usage, a simplified growth animation. Back in our exercise file, locate the object called growth animation and scrub the timeline. Note that frames 0 to 30 are the growth animation, and frames 31 to 60 contain a loopable bend animation. Unhide the absolute by map layer and select the forest object called FP random. Open the animation rollout and check frame from map. For now we only want to look at the growth animation, so change the start value to 0 and the end value to 30. Then click on the map slot and select gradient ramp. To edit the gradient ramp, open the material editor and drag the gradient map to an empty map slot. Now in the gradient ramp parameters, select the middle flag and set the colour to black. Drag it slightly to the left, then create a second flag to the right. Set this one to white. You should now have a gradient with a large black area at the beginning and a large white area at the end, with a short transition in between. So from the materials coordinates rollout, next set the tiling to 0.2. And now we want to animate the gradient moving across the surface, so turn on auto key and animate the U offset value from 1 at frame 0 to -2 at frame 100. And play the animation. You'll see the arrows grow from the right to left, controlled by the grayscale map we just created. In some situations you may need a loop to play after the object has grown. This might be useful, for example, if you had a tree growth animation in a windy environment. This can be achieved by creating animated maps that loop only a portion of the timeline. As we've already seen, this object has a growth animation between 0 and 30, but also a looped bend animation between 31 and 60. If we use a range from 0 to 60 in Forest Pack, this means that the first half of the grayscale gradient ramp will control the growth, while the second half, mid-grey to white, will control the bend animation. This is easier to explain with an example. Change the white mid flag to mid-grey, that's 127, 127, 127. Go into the end flag, the final flag, and change this to the same. If you scrub the timeline now, you'll see that you've just got the first half, the growth animation. Now create another flag just after the mid-grey one and add a composite map texture. Click to color correct this texture, and using this map we can add a solid color. This actually has the benefit of being driven by float numbers rather than RGB values, which can give you more flexibility for longer animations. Between frames 0 and 30, animate the map changing from pure white to pure black, Next, we want to loop that color animation. So open up the graph editor, go to the Edit Materials, and find the gradient ramp we just created. Expand the track until you find the animated color channel. Select it, and open your parameter curves out of range settings. Set it to loop, hit OK, and close the graph editor. If you look at the color swatch, you can see now the color is looping. Next, we want to add an output map, keeping the composite as a submaterial. Enable color map and set the first point to 0.5. This is because our animated color map was going from black to white, but actually we only want it to go from mid-grey to white. And because we're going to composite it with something else later, we don't want to animate just simply from mid-grey, because that would cause problems in the way in which we're going to use blending modes. If you scrub the timeline now, you can see it's starting to work, but there's some glitching. This is because we've only added this map to the first flag and not the last. So if we open up the properties, copy the output map, open the flags properties for the last one, and paste it in as an instance, you now have a fixed area towards the end of the animation with an animated color. So with that done, you have a growth animation, and then you've got an animated loop going on. But how would you go about adding some variation to the looped animation? Well, to do that, we'll go back to our composite map and add a new layer. Then in this layer, add a noise map and set the size to 400 and create a little more contrast by setting the high value to 0.8 and the low value to 0.2. Set the blend mode to difference. If you now play back the animation, you'll get a growth that transitions into a looped bend animation with some randomization added by the noise. As we've mentioned, any map that can be evaluated before render time can be used. So if you're a V-Ray user, it's also possible to use a V-Ray distance texture to drive animations based on their proximity to a list of objects. So to do this, we'll carry on from the previous exercise. But from the animation rollout, set the end frame to 30. We only want the growth animation. Then click on the map slot and add a V-Ray distance text map. Drag this map into the material editor and make some changes. First, set the distance to 3.2 meters. Change the far color to black. Change the near color to white. Check inside color and change the inside color to white also. Go down to the V-Ray distance text objects rollout and click on add and select sphere 01 from the scene. This is currently set to display as box. Now if you pick sphere 1 and move it near the surface of the forest pack object, the arrows will grow as the sphere approaches. If you're not a V-Ray user, it's still possible to get a similar effect by using Vertex colors. To do this, you'll need access to a couple of free scripts. You'll need the Blur Vertex Color modifier. This is a free script by RP Manager written by Grant Adam. It's used to add vertex colors to a stack selection. The link for downloading this can be found in the written version of this tutorial. For the second example, you'll also need the Selection Cache modifier. This enables you to cumulatively cache vertex selections. It can be downloaded from Max Plugins DE. Again, the link is in the written version of this tutorial. So to use this technique, for any renderer, reselect the forest object, open the animation rollout and add a vertex color map. Now select the surface called Plane 4, apply a volume select modifier and set the stack selection mode to vertex. Change select by to object and pick sphere 1 from the scene. Turn on use soft selection and enter a fall off value of 300. Now add a blur vertex color modifier and check convert selection, set the channel to 1, set the steps to something high like 60, and make sure the blur value is about 0.5. If you play back the animation now, you'll see you get a very similar effect using the V-Ray distance text map. But also, if you use this technique in combination with the selection cache modifier, it's also possible to draw a growth animation using another object. So to do this, follow these steps. Add a selection cache modifier between the volume select and the blur vertex color modifiers. Set the mode to replace. Turn on accumulate selection. And we need to save the cache. So click set cache and choose a location to save the file. Then click record to write out the cache. And once this is done, you don't really need the modifiers on below it anymore, so you can click on disable modifiers below to turn off the volume select modifier. And then click play to preview the animation. You'll see that as the sphere moves across the plane, it draws a growth animation in its wake. Now, we've gone into quite a lot of detail about the theory of how ForestPack handles animated geometry and explored the implications of this using a number of abstract examples. To wrap this tutorial up, we'll see how easy and quick it is to use ForestPack to control animated objects. In this short section, we'll use 3 of the techniques described above on a small animated scene to see how they apply in a typical situation. So to get started, open either ForestPack Animation Start Mental Ray or ForestPack Animation Start V-Ray, depending on your renderer. In this file, there are a number of hidden layers you can activate. If you have GrowFX installed, unhide one Forest Object Start GrowFX, otherwise unhide Forest Object Start Standard. If you prefer just to see the end results and you don't want to follow the tutorial, unhide either Forest Objects End GrowFX or Forest Objects End Standard. In all cases, the forest objects have been set up for you with the exception of the animation, which we'll add by following these steps. We're going to start by animating the simplest objects first. The radio telescopes in the scene all move perfectly in sync, so to do this we'll use follow geometry mode. So pick Forest Telescope Start from the scene, scroll down to the animation rollout and turn on follow animation. And that's all you need, but to illustrate some of the interoperability between Railclone and ForestPack, we'll temporarily turn off animate only at render time. Then unhide the animated dish layer and select Railclone Telescope. This is a Railclone object, so we'll go to its display rollout and turn on box mode. Because Forest is in adaptive display mode, it will update to display the 3 boxes that make up the simplified Railclone object. This will preview really quickly in the viewports, but will appear as a full mesh in renders without any need to adjust settings before render time. So that technique worked well for the telescopes, but even with good transform randomization, synchronized trees aren't going to look very convincing. Instead, we'll use random sample mode to create animation variation. To ensure that the animation looks sufficiently differentiated, always use a large time offset value. So select Forest Trees Start, open the animation rollout and check random samples, set the time offset to 15 or higher, and set the count to 6. And it's worth remembering that the count does have an impact on the amount of memory used. And the final one is probably the most complicated in the scene. We're going to look at animating the windswept grass. We want to simulate gusts of wind blowing across the landscape like waves. So in this section we'll create a custom grayscale map to use with the random from map mode. So select Forest Grass Start, and in the animation rollout turn on random from map and turn off animate only at render time. Though we can preview the animation effects in point cloud mode, to see even more clearly the effect of the map we're going to create, it can be helpful to temporarily substitute the plant geometry for something simpler. A useful trick, especially if you're a GrowFX user, is to create a low poly proxy object that contains roughly the same animation as the full geometry. With GrowFX, this is as easy as duplicating the object and deleting more or less everything except a single stem and the wind animation. Because this proxy object is driven by the same wind source as the high-res plants, we'll get a good indication of the finished animation without having to do costly and slow renders. So to further enable us to fine-tune the animation, we'll use a 25-meter patch to help visualize the effect. This has already been created and added to the forest object, so to enable it, go to the areas rollout and turn off the surface area. Still in the areas rollout, turn on rectangle 6 and just adjust the viewport so you can clearly see the grass patch. Go to the geometry rollout and select both items by clicking their names while holding down Control. click on the Custom Object Geometry Picker and select the GrowFX proxy from the scene. Since we're using low poly geometry in a relatively small area, we can temporarily change the display mode to mesh from the display rollout. And finally, just like in our example files, I'm going to change the distribution map to grid, again to help visualize how this map is working. So now we'll create the map. There's any number of ways to approach this, but in this example I'm going to combine two gradient ramps. So let's go back to the animation rollout, click on the map button and select gradient ramp. While we're here, set the time offset to 7 and the count to 20, and then drag the gradient ramp into the material editor as an instance. In the coordinates rollout, check use real world map size, set the width to 12.5 and the height to 25 meters. If you play the animation now, you'll see the offset is creating a wave-like motion, moving horizontally across the screen. To create a wave that moves horizontally and vertically, we'll combine two fall-off maps. Click on the Map Type button and select a composite map. Make sure you keep the existing map as a submap. Click plus to add a new layer and copy the existing gradient ramp to the new texture slot. Rotate the copied gradient ramp by 90 degrees and adjust the width and the height settings so that the width is 25 meters and the height is 12.5. Go back to the composite map and change the top layer's blending mode to darken. If you play the animation now, you should see a wave effect running horizontally and vertically. Finally, to add a little variation, if you have got Burk on maps installed, you can use it to add some distortion. Click on the Map Type button and select Burk on Mapping, keeping the existing map as a submap. For some reason when you do this, Burk on Mapping always applies it to the distortion map slot instead of the main input, so move it over. Then change the type from the top to Explicit Map Channel Real World and rotate the map 45 degrees on the Z axis. In the distortion group, set the strength to 4, add a noise map to the distort map slot and set the noise map size to 30. Now if you play the animation, you'll see a highly randomized wave pattern that simulates wind. All that's needed now is to restore the correct distribution area and geometry settings. So in the display rollout, change the mode to points cloud. In the distribution map rollout, change the map to dense. In the areas rollout, turn off rectangle and turn back on surface area. And in the animation rollout, turn back on animate only at render time. And finally, in the geometry rollout, replace the proxy object with the prairie grass and red fescue objects. With that done, you're ready to render, but I won't make you watch that. So this video represents the final render. The sky and mountains in the background have been added in After Effects, along with some basic post. But hopefully you can see using these techniques allows you a great deal of control when scattering animated objects. From simple synchronized animation to advanced manipulation of offsets and absolute playback using maps. In the last part we covered some basic uses in a real scene, but I hope you can see the creative potential of these techniques and that they help you to save time and produce great work. We'll be returning to animation in future installments and looking at more specific and unusual uses to these tools. In the meantime, stay tuned for future Forest Pack and Rail Clone training, or for more information about many aspects of Forest Pack's features, see our reference section, or visit the tutorials page for more tips and tricks videos and in-depth tutorials.